Welcome to the session. In this session, I'm going to discuss this topic in chapter 1, investment opportunities set with two assets. Here, we are going to use an example, and the example is based on the materials so far in this chapter. Let's go back to the beginning of the chapter. Here, we calculated the expected return for stock A here, and the expected return for stock B here, 0.15, 0.1964. Now, I want you to keep in mind all these numbers. We are going to use them in the example. And for the variance, we have 0.053 for A, 0.1159 for B. And we take the square root for the variance to get a standard deviation. And it is 0.2302 for A and 0.3404 for B. Also, we are given a correlation coefficient between A and B is 0. Then, based on these numbers, we talk about portfolio expected return. It is just the weighted average of individual returns. So the portfolio has a expected return equal to 0.1732. Now remember, this number is based on the weight of 0.5 for A and 0.5 for B. Then we calculate the variance for the portfolio. Now this is the general equation for the variance with double summation. But if n is only 2, in other words, we have only 2 assets in the portfolio, then this equation here becomes this following equation. Now, fortunately, we have all the numbers for this equation. This is the weight for A squared, so 0.5 squared. This number here is the variance for A, and that is taken from above, okay? From here, right? And for B, it is 0.1159, right? So 0.1159, okay? So the weight for B is also 0.5 and squared. Then we have 2, the weight for A, the weight for B. This is the correlation between A and B. And that is also given here, right? And this number is the standard deviation for A and the standard deviation for B. They are from here, right? So we calculate the variance based on these numbers. We get 0.0422. And then we take the square root of it to get a standard deviation, 0.2055, right? So with those numbers, we can discuss this topic, investment opportunities set with two assets. Now, in this particular set of numbers here, these numbers come from all the calculations up to this point, okay, up to this point. For example, here, again, the weight for A is 0.5, and the weight for B is also 0.5. And based on these weights, we obtain the expected return for the portfolio of 0.1732 here. And the portfolio standard deviation, 0.2055. Here, right? Now, of course, that we can construct the portfolio in any way. In other words, that in different sets of weights. For example, here is the portfolio with a 0 investment in A and 100% investment in B. In this portfolio, we have 10% weight for A and 90% weight for B, and so on. Up to this portfolio, we have 100% investment in A and 0% of the money investing in B. Now, each set of weights will give a different expected return on the portfolio and a different standard deviation of the portfolio. We can calculate both numbers by this equation here and this equation here and here, right? And we obtain all these numbers. So under each set of weights, we calculate expected return for the portfolio, standard deviation of the portfolio. Now, here, if we plot all the 11 portfolios here based on return and standard deviation, based on return and standard deviation, okay, then the 11 portfolios would form this curve. This is the portfolio 11 here, right? With 100% investment in A and 0% in B. So basically, this is just asset A, all right? Here, okay? And this portfolio is actually portfolio 1 with all investment in B and 0 investment in A. Right? So this is just asset B, right? Here, okay? And then portfolio 2, 3, and so on to 10 will be portfolio 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So it's interesting that these 11 portfolios will form a curve, not a line, not a straight line, but a curve. Of course, that the construction of these portfolios is all based on the assumption that the correlation between the two assets, A and B, is 0. In other words, that when we calculate the variance, we enter a correlation equal 0. Then we are ready to talk about diversification. Again, the expected return of the portfolio is equal to the weighted average of the individual expected return. This equation here, right, from above. Now, the standard deviation of the portfolio is less than the weighted average of the individual standard deviations, as long as the correlation is less than 1. Keep this in mind. The standard deviation of the portfolio is less than the weighted average of the two individual standard deviations, as long as the correlation coefficient is less than 1. In mathematical expression, if the correlation is less than 1, well, then the standard deviation is less than the weighted average. So, as long as the standard deviation of the portfolio is less than the weighted average of the individual standard deviations, there is diversification. And the definition of diversification is the reduction of risk without sacrificing the return. And here's the key. A lower correlation between the two assets increases the degree of diversification. If A and B are less correlated, then we can obtain more diversification by combining A and B into a portfolio. Now we have some numbers. Again, we use the numbers that we obtained here above. So remember, we have these two numbers. When we give equal weight, we combine A and B with equal weights, then we have this expected return and this standard deviation. These are from above, right? Then let's calculate the weighted average of the two individual standard deviations. Again, it's the weight for A, standard deviation for A, and the weight for B, standard deviation for B, turns out to be 0.2853. So the portfolio standard deviation that we obtain here is less than the weighted average. Okay. The portfolio standard deviation is less than the weighted average of the individual standard deviations, this number. So diversification exists, right? Notice that we are able to reduce the risk for the portfolio without sacrificing the return. Because the return the portfolio is equal to the weighted average. It's not less than, okay? It is equal to the weighted average. So that's where we didn't sacrifice the return, but the risk is less than the weighted average. Let me repeat. The return is not less than weighted average. the return is equal to the weighted average. So there's no special advantage there, it's just fair, right? But the risk is less than the weighted average. So there's a special advantage here in terms of the risk. Therefore, diversification benefit exists. For example, again, we use A and B to form the portfolio. And now we use correlation equal to 1 instead of 0. First, let's calculate the expected return of the portfolio. It's against weighted average. So it is still 0.1732. So this number didn't change. Although the correlation now is 1, okay? The expected return for the portfolio still remains the same as before. Then we calculate the variance based on this new correlation, 1, and then standard deviation, okay? Now this time, the portfolio standard deviation is 0.2853. It happens to be equal to the weighted average here. So there is no special advantage in terms of the risk in this case. In other words, that the risk for a portfolio is just equal to the weighted average, just like the return. The return is also equal to the weighted average. So there's no special advantage in this case. So there's no diversification. In other words, that if the correlation between the two assets is equal to 1, then there's no diversification. This is understandable because if the correlation is equal to perfect 1, then A and B always move together. Always move together. So there's no offset from combining the two assets. So there will be no diversification benefit. Let's try again. This time, we assume that the correlation is -1 instead of 0. Again, we calculate expected return. That is still the same number, 0.1732. Then we calculate the variance based on a correlation of -1, and then standard deviation here. This time, the standard deviation of the portfolio is less than the weighted average. So there's diversification benefit again. Actually, there is maximum diversification in this case. The reduction of risk is the greatest if the correlation between the two assets is -1. So up to this point, we have calculated many numbers based on correlation equal to 1 or 0 or -1. Under each correlation, we calculate expected return of the portfolio and the standard deviation. You can tell that the expected return doesn't change, stay the same, regardless of the correlation coefficient. But the standard deviation of the portfolio, the risk of the portfolio changes In fact, when the correlation becomes more negative, the standard deviation becomes smaller. So, if we combine A and B into portfolios, of course, that we can just change the weight for the two assets. Then, using the equations that we have learned up to this point to calculate the portfolio expected return and the portfolio standard deviation, and plot all the portfolios on this map. So let's go from this curve here. This is the curve based on the correlation equals 0. So all the combinations of A and B, all the combinations by the weights, all the combinations using A and B would form this curve based on expected return and standard deviation of the portfolio. Now, if the weight is 0.5 for A and 0.5 for B, then we are at this portfolio, which is this expected return and this standard deviation. If the correlation between A and B is 1, then all the combinations between A and B would form this line section. And with the weight for A equal to 0.5 and the weight for B equal to also 0.5, we are at this portfolio here with this expected return and this standard deviation. If the correlation between A and B is -1, then all the combinations of A and B would form these two line sections. Again, with equal weights for A and B, 0.5 and 0.5, then we are at this portfolio with this return and this risk. So basically, we are talking about this table, right? With equal weight, okay? Yeah, right. So you can tell when the correlation becomes smaller, or even negative, okay? With a certain weight for A and B, for example, here, 0.5 and 0.5, the portfolio expected return doesn't change regardless of the correlation. Okay? But the standard deviation becomes smaller and smaller when the correlation becomes more negative. However, it is difficult to find two assets that have a correlation equal to 1 or -1. In other words, that it is difficult to find two assets with perfect correlation, either positive or negative. So if you randomly pick two assets, all the portfolios that are a combination of these assets are more likely to form a curve, like this one. if we extend the arguments up to this point to an n asset portfolio. Now remember, the standard deviation of the portfolio is equal to this equation here. Inside this square root is the variance, right? So here is the variance. We take a square root to get the standard deviation. The standard deviation of the portfolio would be less than the weighted average of the individual standard deviations. This is the sum of the weighted standard deviations, right? Okay. Every pair of assets in this portfolio has a correlation. And this inequality holds. This inequality becomes true if any of the correlation coefficient is less than 1. Right? So if we have n assets in a portfolio, we have many pairs, right? Many pairs in a portfolio. And every pair has a correlation coefficient. As long as one of the correlation coefficients is less than 1, then this inequality holds and diversification exists. Okay. In this session, we will end here. Thank you for watching.